What would you do if you saw a woman in a wedding dress standing alone at a train station? No luggage, no one waiting, just clutching a ring that was never given. No tears, no explanation, only a stranger pulling over, meeting her eyes, then unlocking the passenger door. And from that very moment, everything started to change. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share in the comments what you would do in that moment. Because after this story, you might never look at a wedding ring the same way again. Anastasia Bennett, in a tattered wedding dress, sat on the curb outside Canyonfield Station, where trains came and went, yet no one asked who she was waiting for. No tears, no one to call. Only the wind tugged at the torn veil, still clinging to dried petals. And her hand gripped a ring that had never been placed. An old truck rolled to a stop near the platform. No honking, no one stepped out. Just a nod, and the door swung open. The man didn't ask her name, didn't care where she came from. He just offered her shelter, like someone who once knew the weight of silence. At Stonebriar Auto and Salvage, where everything was old and abandoned, she slept on a sagging couch in the cluttered office. Her dress still stained, but for the first time, no one told her to take it off. The next morning, she took off the ring. No crying, no words. She placed it inside a small wooden box and tucked it into a drawer, like a quiet funeral for a dream that never got the chance to breathe. And out in the backyard behind the shop, once a junkyard of discarded tires, she knelt and dug up rotting roots, planting new seeds one by one. She didn't know why, only that something inside her hadn't completely given up. He, Julian Carter, never asked what had happened. But every evening, after the echo of his lone hammer faded from the garage, he'd stand by the loft window, watching the woman with scratched hands bring life back to the garden his late wife once dreamed of. One rainy night, during a power outage, they sat together in the tiny kitchen, sharing a half-eaten bowl of instant noodles. Neither spoke, but the way she stayed even after the rain stopped said more than any plea to stay ever could. And when her father came, bearing apologies and a blueprint to reclaim control over her life, Julian stood still. He didn't stop her, didn't reach for her, just took a quiet step back, the same way he had when his wife walked away for the last time. Anastasia almost left, but at the doorway she paused. Upstairs in the small room where Julian had kept all his late wife's unfinished sketches, a soft light glowed, and there it was, a new drawing she had once forgotten, a ring resting between two open palms. No one asked her to stay, but the next morning the sound of a chisel echoed, the first piece of pinewood atelier being rebuilt, one plank at a time, just as she'd once whispered about in her sleep. He never said, "I love you." She never asked what's next. But every morning, on the porch bench, there were 2 cups of tea, one warm, one gone cold, but always there. And on one late autumn afternoon, she asked quietly, "If I left, would you come find me?" Julian nodded, no words. But that look in his eyes made it impossible for her to go. No vows, no promises, but a silent truth hung in the air. Even without saying it, he had chosen to stay. An old pickup truck pulled up just outside the fog-covered station. Behind the wheel was Julian Carter, a mechanic who lived alone at Hollow Pines Garage, where the loudest sounds were the clinking of wrenches and the crackle of an AM radio swallowed by the wind. He didn't step out, just reached over and opened the door, tilting his head slightly toward the dirt-streaked woman sitting on the curb. No questions, no words, as if he'd seen something like this before, somewhere buried in his own past. Anastasia Bennett climbed in, veil still in place. She sat beside a stranger, yet felt more at peace than she ever had with those who'd just abandoned her. The drive was quiet. Only the blinking signal lights and the whistle of wind through a cracked window filled the space between them. Julian didn't take her to the main house. Instead, he opened the door to a utility room behind the shop, once his late wife's workspace, before illness took her years ago. No explanation, just an old blanket, folded and placed gently on a worn-out chair. When Anastasia tried to thank him, he shook his head, then walked out, closing the door behind him like someone sealing off a memory. She didn't sleep that night, Instead, she wandered through the garage, fingertips grazing the walls lined with vintage car posters, oil-stained diagrams, and one faded photo of a woman smiling beside an open window that overlooked a wild, overgrown garden. That garden was right behind the room where Anastasia now stayed. At dawn, she stepped outside. The cold bit through the mist, dew clinging to the tall grass, brushing her knees. No one told her what to do, but something wordless stirred inside her. She started pulling weeds, turning soil, lifting stones one by one, as if action alone could patch the hollow inside her. From behind the shop's oil-streaked curtain, Julian watched. He didn't know why he brought her back, but maybe, in that split second when he saw her eyes, lost but still clinging to life, he remembered himself 5 years ago, sitting on the garage floor, hands bloodied from trying and failing to save his wife. By midday, when the sun finally warmed the ground, she collapsed onto the soil. Her wedding dress was caked with mud, hands torn by thorns, but she didn't complain. Julian walked over, handed her a cold glass of iced tea, then quietly pulled a splinter from her palm. No words were exchanged, but that small, gentle touch said enough. We're both trying to stitch ourselves back together. That evening, she didn't return to the utility room. Julian had cleared a corner of the loft, the one space he'd avoided for years, just enough to place a small table, 2 wooden chairs, and a single oil lamp. They shared instant noodles. She asked, "You fix cars to make a living?" Julian shook his head. "I fix cars to keep myself alive." And that was the first thread that tied them, not with stories, but with silence, presence, and the quiet compassion of 2 people who had lost too much, yet still waited for someone to come in and not leave. Julian didn't ask questions. He simply let her take shelter in the old supply room behind the garage, the space where he kept things he couldn't bear to throw away. His late wife's coat, dried-out cans of paint, an unfinished portrait, and a threadbare cushion chair where Anastasia curled up like she was trying to vanish from the world entirely. That night, the rain came hard. The tin roof leaked. She sat hugging her knees while Julian stood just beyond the wall, holding a small flashlight, inspecting the drainage pipe, worried the leak might soak the floor where she slept. He slipped, slicing his hand on a rusted sheet of metal. But the next morning, there was only a hastily placed bandage. No one mentioned it, as if quiet kindness didn't need a name. A few days later, sunlight finally pierced through the cracks in the storage room door. That morning, her father arrived. A sleek black car pulled up in front of the garage. He stepped out, his posture sharp, the kind of man used to giving orders, never hearing answers. "Anastasia, enough of this nonsense. Come home," he said flatly, not once glancing at Julian. She stood still. The wedding ring she had removed now sat heavy in the pocket of an old jacket, like a stone tied to memory. Julian said nothing, but his gaze, steady, deep, calm, spoke clearly. "I won't stop you, but I understand if going back feels like walking into a place you no longer belong." She turned to leave, but stopped. Ahead was the art room, the white door weathered and faded. Inside sat an easel, thick with dust, once used by Julian's late wife to teach children from town. No one had stepped into that space in 4 years, but today Julian had left it open, as if saying, "If you're ready, you can walk in." Anastasia approached, gently touching a brittle paintbrush still standing in an old jar. She said nothing, but from that moment on she didn't leave. Not because her father failed to take her, but because for the first time she felt a door had been left open for her. From that simple nod, Julian began doing something even he couldn't quite explain. He reopened Pinewood Atelier, the old art room he'd sealed shut after his wife passed. He peeled back the dusty claws, wiped down every wooden stair, and quietly hung the unfinished painting, where the woman's face had no eyes, only a faint tilt of the head, as if waiting for someone to complete what had been left undone. Anastasia entered that room one rainy afternoon, after Julian had gone. She stood in front of the painting for a long while. Then, without a word, she dipped a hardened watercolor tin into the cold tea she was holding. She didn't finish the painting. She simply cleaned the mirror across from it, just enough to see herself more clearly in a room that never used to belong to her. The next morning, Julian left a sandwich on the loft table, the one spot they had never shared before. No note, but next to it was a small cloth napkin with a heart stitched into the corner, upside down. Careless? Maybe. But it made her laugh, even if just for a second. She started staying longer, no longer confined to the storage room, no longer hiding in the shadows. She began watering the garden out back, the one once filled with weeds and rusted cans. Julian didn't say a word. He just replaced the leaky hose and added a wooden bench by the fence, wide enough for two, but angled so they never had to face each other. They never called each other by name, but every gesture, from a paintbrush laid precisely where it should be, to a rag already soaked in oil, was an unspoken invitation to simply exist, together. Not for the sake of the past, but for something unnamed, quietly growing between them. Julian never spoke Lillian's name, but the loft room, where her old woven chair still sat beside the moss-green teapot she once loved, remained untouched, like a memory wrapped in stillness. Out back, the garden behind the garage, long abandoned and silent, began to breathe again, revived by Anastasia's own hands. No one told her to do it. She simply went out each morning, picking up shattered tiles, pulling weeds from cracked soil, pouring water into brittle succulents that felt as parched as her own heart. Not to decorate, but to survive. Julian watched from behind the fog glass window, a cooling cup of coffee in his hand. He never stepped in to help, but he let her stay there. That alone meant something. He hadn't allowed anyone that close since Lillian left. One night, during a blackout, the shop was swallowed by darkness. Anastasia fumbled through shelves for a candle and touched a small wooden box. Inside, she found colored spools of thread, a pair of worn women's gloves, and an unsent letter. Its single line read, "If you forget me, the garden will remind you." The next morning, Julian placed a wooden basket by the door that led to the garden. Inside was a new pair of pruning shears, just like the ones Lillian once used, with leather-wrapped iron handles. No words were exchanged, but the following day, both of them were there. One watering plants, the other fixing a broken lamppost. No conversation, no explanation. Just two people, quietly returning to a place they had once left empty. No one asked her to do it. No one ever said thank you. But every morning, as Julian poured his coffee in the garage, he saw her, bent low, quietly picking dried weeds from the soil. The same hands that once trembled as she slipped off her ring now dug deep into the earth, searching for some fragment of control in a life that had fallen apart. One rainy morning, she still went outside. Her dress clung to her legs, soaked and heavy, hair plastered to her cheek. Julian stood beneath the awning, holding an old umbrella loosely in his hand, unsure whether to step out or wait for her to come in. He stayed still, but as he turned away, he left a dry towel draped across the stone bench, his silent way of saying, "I saw you." That night, her face appeared in the flickering yellow glow of the loft. Julian sat at the old wooden table, working on a broken desk lamp. She walked past, almost kept going, but stopped. No questions, no greeting. She simply sat across from him, the space between them stretched with unspoken weight, but softened by the quiet understanding they both carried. He set the lamp down and slid it toward her. "Do you know how to fix this?" His first words since the day they met. She gave a small nod, and in that moment, it wasn't love, it wasn't pity, it was something quieter, like a single root pressing into damp soil, in a garden that once forgot how to grow. Julian stood behind the fogged-up window, coffee untouched in his hand. Out in the garden, the girl in the faded wedding dress, knees streaked with mud, was carefully gathering scattered pebbles along the narrow path. No one had taught her to do it, but she was placing each stone back in line, as if even the smallest details deserved to return to where they once belonged. He remembered, Lillian once said, "People don't arrange stones to walk away. They arrange them to remind themselves they're still here." And in that moment he realized, those hands were rebuilding a part of his heart he thought had crumbled with the years. That afternoon, the sun blazed high. She collapsed in the garden. No warning, no cry for help. Julian carried her into the workshop, gently bandaged the scrape on her arm, then placed an old fan by the makeshift bed, its blades humming with wear. When she woke, he was gone. Only a scrap of paper remained, the ink smudged slightly as if rushed. You don't have to do it all alone. That night, she prepared a tray of food and left it by the loft table. No thank you, no explanation. Julian saw it, but he didn't come out. Instead, he turned on one more light along the stairwell. In that quiet, something was shifting. Not loud, not rushed, just two broken souls, slowly aligning, like small stones being placed one by one. No words needed. On a rainy night, the old tin roof of Maple Bench Loft echoed with the steady rhythm of a restless heart. Anastasia poured tea, her hands trembling slightly from the cold. Julian added another log to the loft's fireplace, then quietly pulled the wooden chair across from hers. No words were exchanged, but the amber glow of the ceiling light, the shared warmth of 2 cups of tea, and the soft patter of rain against the windows told a gentler story than any conversation ever could. She took a bite of the toast, burned on one side from her clumsy baking earlier, and let out a soft laugh. Julian glanced at her, and without knowing why, he laughed too. For the first time in years, he laughed without feeling like he was betraying Lillian's memory. Then the light flickered out. The town had lost power. In the sudden darkness, she reached out and brushed his arm by mistake. Just a small touch. But Julian didn't pull away. Instead, he slid the small desk flashlight toward her. A simple gesture, but more than enough to say, "I'm here." And when she turned the beam back toward him, the light grazed the fatigue in his face, the eyes that had never truly been forgiven. She understood then. The man sitting across from her had lost more than he ever said out loud, and he was still learning how to be trusted again. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside that quiet loft, two people were slowly learning how to sit beside each other again. Not for the past, not for the future, but simply because, tonight, neither of them wanted to eat alone. That night, as the soft amber light spilled across the weathered brick walls of Maple Bench Loft, Julian spoke, suddenly. He didn't look at her, just stared at his own hands, at the place where a ring used to rest, but was no longer there. Do you think someone can love again, after losing the only thing they ever believed would last forever? The question had no subject, no weight of expectation. It was just a shard of something unspoken, drifting quietly through the night. Anastasia set her cup down, silent. She knew he was speaking of Lillian, his late wife, but the way he spoke, there was no bitterness, no grief heavy enough to drown in, only the soft ache of something once beautiful. Julian continued, his voice low, as if he were speaking to the part of himself still unsure. She used to say, "Love doesn't have to start over. It just needs enough courage to open the door again." And in his eyes, she didn't see emptiness. She saw the quiet exhaustion of someone left behind, someone trying to live on, even when everything familiar had been stripped away. Then, unexpectedly, Anastasia whispered, "I don't know if I'm brave, but I do know I'm tired. Tired of always running." It wasn't advice. It wasn't comfort. It was something else, an offering of empathy. A quiet way of saying that maybe neither of them was alone in their hurt. Julian said nothing more, but for the first time, when she looked directly into his eyes, he didn't look away. Outside, the night wind still moved through the trees, but inside that little loft, something, small and fragile, had begun to loosen itself from old scars. Anastasia didn't answer right away. She just looked down at her hand, where the ring still sat, cold and heavy like a promise that had never been spoken aloud. Her fingers trembled slightly. She didn't cry. She simply slipped the ring off, like she was peeling away a memory that never fully formed, yet somehow managed to leave a scar. Julian saw it. He didn't ask. He didn't step in. But in that quiet moment, no words, no dramatic pause, something shifted. It was more than empathy. It was the first step towards something greater, the choice to finally forgive oneself. She placed the ring on the weathered wooden windowsill of the loft. Moonlight struck its surface, casting a faint blurry glow, like a closing line that didn't need to be spoken. Then she turned, walked toward the old wooden table where he was steeping tea, and said in a voice so soft it barely rose above the stillness, If you need help clearing out the art room tomorrow, I could do that. Not because she had time, not because she knew how to paint, but because she understood now. Sometimes the ones who hurt the most are the ones who never say they're hurting. Julian set his teacup down. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. But he pulled out the chair beside him, the way he always did. Quiet, steady, unspoken. And that was how two fractured people, each carrying the weight of what they never said, stepped into a night without defenses, without pretending to be okay, and began at last to relearn the simplest thing, how to be present together. The next morning, through the thin veil of mist that blanketed the quiet town, a sleek black car rolled to a stop in front of the garage. Nathaniel Sterling, the man once called Anastasia's father, stepped out. His suit was flawless, the white pocket square perfectly folded, but nothing could hide the weariness etched into his eyes. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," right away. Instead, he placed a blank check on the old workbench, as if trying to buy back the years he had chosen to miss. Anastasia stood there, her hands still marked with soil from the backyard garden, looking at him like a stranger she used to know far too well. No anger, no accusation, just the wide, silent distance of everything that had been lost for too long. Julian watched from the back doorway. He saw her fingers clench, not at the sight of the check, but at the gaze of a man who once dictated every choice in her life, now standing before her as if he hadn't left scars deep enough to reshape her. She didn't touch the check. She just said one sentence, so soft it barely rose above the morning breeze. "I never needed money. I just needed a father who would stay." Nathaniel said nothing, but in his eyes something fractured, or perhaps for the first time, something finally gave way. No one told him to leave, but he knew he wasn't welcome, not out of hatred, but because his absence had become too heavy, too long to reverse. The car pulled away in silence. What remained was a daughter, standing alone in the soft morning light, for the first time, facing the pain she used to flinch from, without turning away. Anastasia watched Nathaniel standing in the worn doorway of the garage, sunlight slicing through the fog glass behind him, casting his shadow across the floor. A father who once chose power over love. "You're too late." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a chill that made him stop in his tracks. Nathaniel held the check in his hand, then slowly tore it apart. But the shredded papers saved nothing. It couldn't buy back the birthdays he missed, the scraped knees met only with disapproval, the silence that followed every time she needed warmth and got control instead. She didn't cry. She simply pointed toward the door, a gesture firm and unyielding, an unspoken farewell with no room left for softness. "I've forgiven you, but I don't need you anymore." Julian stood just outside beside the rusted tool shelf. He heard every word, but he didn't step in. He knew that moment didn't need interference, only quiet witness. Nathaniel lowered his head, not because of what she said, but because, for the first time, he understood. What he'd lost wasn't wealth, wasn't status, but the one chance he ever had to be a father. He turned and walked away. His shadow stretched across the concrete, growing smaller with each step, as if the space between them had finally settled, not through reconciliation, but through boundary. Anastasia stood there for a long while. Then she turned back toward the art room, where the scent of old paint and unfinished walls still waited for her. For the first time, she didn't run from the wound. She chose to stay, not because the pain was gone, but because she was finally strong enough to face it and to begin again, exactly where everything once broke. She stepped out of the garage, her hands still trembling from the confrontation with her past. The air outside was crisp, the scent of damp wood mingling with the faint trace of old paint lingering on the concrete. As she walked past the row of old rooms, she stopped. The wooden door, where she had first taken shelter, was different now. Still the same room, but cleaned, renewed. The floorboards had been replaced, small windows invited in the light, and on the simple wooden table sat an easel, a box of unopened paints, and a single blank sheet of paper, waiting for its first stroke. She didn't need to ask. She knew Julian had done this, quietly, without a word. Just left it there, like an invitation, soft and steady, as if he understood she needed one more reason not to walk back through that gate. Anastasia stepped inside, laid her hand gently on the box of paints. Her eyes burned, not because of the room itself, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, someone had silently prepared a place for her to stay. She turned back and saw Julian standing under the eaves, the fading light of late afternoon catching the silver threads in his hair. They didn't speak, but their eyes met, long enough to know that sometimes what we need isn't an apology, but someone who's still here after everything. Anastasia didn't leave. She returned to the room, opened the box of colors, and made her first mark on the white canvas. And for her, that was the beginning. No wedding, no witness, just a quiet, steady return to herself. It was the studio, Pinewood Atelier, the one she had mentioned only once, over dinner on a rainy night. There'd been no plan, no sketch, just a fleeting thought spoken between sips of tea. And yet, Julian had rebuilt it, quietly, precisely. From the old oak paint shelf she'd once described, to the crooked swivel chair she used to complain about, but always sat in anyway because it keeps me from getting lazy. The back wall was repainted in that exact stormy blue-gray she'd offhandedly called her favorite. A linen curtain hung loosely by the window, soft enough to let the sunlight in without blinding it. And in the center of the room stood the easel, holding a half-finished painting, rough strokes, incomplete, but unmistakably the first sketch she'd once abandoned. Someone had found it, kept it, and placed it here. Anastasia stood still, her breath weighted not by surprise but by something else. The feeling of being remembered, fully, without having to repeat herself, without having to ask. Behind her, Julian entered the room. He didn't speak, just placed a soft cloth over the chair and turned to leave. She called out, her voice the first in days. "Why this room?" He paused, not turning around. "Because you deserve something that doesn't get left unfinished." And for the first time she cried, not from pain, but because, finally, someone believed she was worth staying for. Anastasia broke into tears, not the dramatic, shattering kind she used to know. These were quiet tears, the kind that fall when someone feels, for the first time, truly believed in. Not pitied, not bound, just trusted. She stepped toward the easel, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the brush box. Its lid had been replaced, smooth pine, engraved with a small line she had once scribbled in a forgotten notebook years ago, draw like no one ever left. She turned to look at Julian. He was just beyond the window, wiping the last smudge of dust from the old glass pane. He didn't turn back, didn't ask if she was okay. He was simply there. The room didn't need music. No glow from perfect lighting, just the scent of warm wood and faint, diluted paint curling into the air. And silence. Not the kind that isolates, but the kind that heals. She picked up a brush. Didn't start painting yet, just let the bristles rest on the canvas, marking the first stroke. Julian never looked over, but she knew. He was listening to every quiet motion behind him. A man who never promised to love her forever, but did something deeper. He prepared a space where she could finally learn to love herself again. Julian never asked her to stay. He just stood there, leaning slightly, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. Not intrusive, not possessive, simply present. A small gesture, yet it silenced something deep within Anastasia. She turned. Their eyes met, not for long, not needing words. But in that look was something that took her back to a moment she had buried, the day her mother died. She had sat just like this, waiting for someone, anyone to say, "Stay." No one ever came, until now. He didn't know it, but that quiet touch on her shoulder made it impossible for her to walk away. That night she didn't sleep. She stayed in the art room, painting beneath the soft hum of a single lamp. Julian left a cup of tea outside the door. No knock, no note. And by morning, when sunlight spilled through the dusty window, she found an old jacket draped over her shoulders. Silent, kind, completely present. As if he had stayed in the hallway all night, just to make sure, if she ever collapsed, she wouldn't be alone. She wrote 3 small words in the corner of the canvas she just finished. I'll stay. And in that quiet, unwitnessed moment, something that felt like home began to take root in her heart. She stayed. No announcement, no declaration, just the next morning, she was still there, sitting quietly on the steps of Pinewood Atelier, a warm cup of tea in her hands, the one Julian had left for her. And just like that, they began a stretch of days without definitions. Not lovers, not quite friends. Just two people quietly coexisting in the same rhythm. Anastasia tended to the corners of the studio, fixing the shelves, planting soft blooms behind the garage. Julian reset the old easels, rebuilt empty frames with salvaged wood from the abandoned mill on the east side of town. They were always busy, but they left breadcrumbs for each other. A folded cloth, a sharpened pencil, a soft piece of music playing in the background when she painted. One rainy night, the power went out. She cried in the dark, not out of fear, but because everything she'd buried for so long finally spilled over. Julian didn't speak. He brought in an oil lamp, set it on the table, and sat silently in the corner of the room. He didn't leave. She fell asleep eventually, and when she woke, the morning light spilled through the cracks in the window. He was still there, head resting against the wooden wall, his coat draped over her shoulders, and his breath as steady in the quiet. That's when she realized. Presence without condition was how he loved. No noise, no demands. Just always there, like a gentle awning in the middle of a storm with no name. One afternoon, as golden sunlight blanketed the garden behind Bloomfield Yard, Anastasia was watering a row of lavender when she suddenly paused. The breeze swept gently over her shoulder, carrying the soft scent through the air. She turned to look at Julian, quietly working on a weathered wooden frame beneath the porch. Julian. Her voice was low, hesitant. If I left, would you come find me? There was no answer right away, only the soft clatter of wood and a silence that stretched long enough to feel like it was holding its breath. Then he looked up, eyes steady, unblinking. He nodded. Just once, a simple gesture, but it reached deeper than any words she had ever heard. It didn't beg. It didn't plead. It was a choice, quiet, unconditional. She didn't speak again. She set the watering can down, unfastened the handkerchief tied around her wrist, a small gift he had once left in the studio, without a note, and walked toward him. They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. They simply sat together, backs against the wall, shoulders just touching, as petals drifted down in the hush of late afternoon. And from that moment on, she never left again. No one named what they had. They simply lived, as if the other was home. A quiet kind of belonging. No vows, no ceremonies. That morning, Anastasia gathered a few belongings, carefully, unhurriedly, as if even she wasn't certain whether she was leaving or staying. Julian stood at the doorway of the garage, holding the coffee mug she always used. He didn't speak. She turned to look at him, and in his eyes she didn't see hesitation or resistance. She saw something rarer, the gift of freedom. You don't owe anyone anything, he'd once said on a rainy night. But today it wasn't words. It was his gaze that said it best. If you need to go to be true to yourself, I'll let you go. She walked to the gate, paused. The wind stirred through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth from the night's rain. And there, in the middle of a quiet town, where no one begged her to stay, where no one reached to pull her back, Anastasia broke into tears. Not from weakness, but because, for the first time in her life, she had met a man strong enough not to control love. A man broken enough to understand the weight of freedom, and still silent enough to become the place she longed to return to. She turned back, gently removed her shoes, and walked barefoot down the gravel path into Bloomfield Yard. No words. But when Julian placed his hand softly on her shoulder, light enough not to make a sound, it was the answer she didn't know she'd been waiting for. And she didn't leave, because she finally understood. There was nowhere else she wanted to go, now that she had found a place that felt like safe. The first spring in Hollow Pines came without wedding bells, without a white dress, without vows under twinkling lights. Just two people, once broken, once lost, gently choosing to stay by doing the smallest things together. Anastasia sat beneath the wildflower trellis behind the shop, brewing tea in an old teapot she'd found buried in the storeroom. Julian was hunched over a sewing machine, something he had no idea how to use, yet was determined to fix. Simply because she once said, "If I could patch my quilt again, I think I'd sleep better." No one said, "I love you." No one asked, "What are we?" There was only one truth between them. They had chosen not to leave. One afternoon, she quietly placed her hand on his work table without looking at him. He didn't pull away, and that meant more than any promise she'd ever been given. She used to fear love because it always came with conditions, with sharp edges that cut. But here love had no label. It was the kitchen light that never went off at night, the scent of mint tea easing her into quiet, the rhythmic knock of a hammer outside the door still waiting to be repainted. No wedding, no bouquet, no vows, just two people, one shattered, mending quilts, growing plants, fixing broken things, and in doing so, slowly healing each other. No wedding, no promises, but one silent vow. Even without saying it, he chose to stay. If you've ever seen yourself somewhere in this story, if you've ever lost something, feared loving again, or stayed quiet instead of holding on, tell me how it made you feel. Because maybe, just maybe, someone out there is searching for the answer you just found. And if stories like this quietly find a way into your heart, follow the channel so I have a reason to keep telling them. The kind of stories that don't shout, but stay. Some people enter our lives not with promises, but with quiet presence. Julian never asked why a girl in a dirt-stained wedding dress was standing alone at Canyonfield Station. He simply nodded, opened his truck door, and drove her to the garage, where there was nothing but the wind and the scent of old paint. And yet, in that rough space filled with scrap wood in a dried-out garden, Anastasia began to come back to life. Not through grand passion, but through things without names, like a warm cup of tea in the afternoon, or the soft touch of a shoulder on a silent day. She used to believe love meant weddings, bouquets, rings, and vows. But when Julian quietly rebuilt the art room she'd only mentioned once, when he fixed a sewing machine no one used, simply because she said she missed sewing, she understood. Some loves are never spoken aloud, but run deeper than anything words could ever hold. In the end, she didn't leave. Not because someone begged her to stay, but because she chose to remain in a place where she was heard with the whole heart, without ever having to speak. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes what heals us isn't a forever promise, but someone patient enough to sit beside us, day after day, quietly until we believe we deserve to be loved again.